The surrender was not a moment, but a slow unraveling. For Japanese soldiers taken prisoner in the Pacific Theater, the idea of captivity itself was already beyond imagination. Their code had prepared them for death, not for laying down arms in front of the enemy. When captured, many expected humiliation, punishment, and perhaps even immediate execution. Instead, they found themselves herded into organized camps on American soil, processed with precision, and handed blankets, rations, and a place to sleep. The confusion was overwhelming. The silence of the nights, broken only by distant voices and the sounds of guards changing shifts, became a space where fear mixed with disbelief. They were alive, but what awaited them was even stranger than survival. The first days were marked by constant tension. Every movement of American soldiers was watched with suspicion, every gesture interpreted through the lens of propaganda that had long told them Americans were brutal, godless enemies. Instead, the guards were brisk, but not cruel, issuing orders in firm tones, sometimes accompanied by gestures to aid understanding. Rations were distributed regularly, and even medical inspections took place, something few captives had expected. The Japanese prisoners whispered among themselves, wondering if this treatment was a prelude to harsher measures. For men raised in a society where loyalty to the emperor was itself a sacred act, to suddenly find themselves in enemy hands but treated as human beings was a contradiction that gnawed at their minds. In the barracks, time stretched. Prisoners learned to cope with routine, wake-up calls, roll calls, meals, work assignments. Yet it was in these lulls, between labor and enforced idleness, that they noticed something unexpected. Beyond the barbed wire, within the camp, there were buildings clearly set aside not for administration or storage, but for worship. Small chapels with simple wooden crosses, chaplains in uniform carrying books and speaking gently to men who gathered voluntarily. The sight was puzzling. In the Japanese military, spirituality was fused with nationalism, embodied in rituals tied to Shinto shrines and emperor worship. Here, in the very heart of enemy territory, religion was practiced openly, without secrecy, and astonishingly, without compulsion. At first, the prisoners avoided direct contact. Watching from a distance, they noted that American soldiers knelt, sang, and bowed their heads without anyone forcing them to do so. Some whispered prayers aloud. Others stood at the doors of chapels, welcoming whoever entered, without distinction between ranks. The prisoners compared this to the rigidity of their own upbringing, where devotion was not a choice, but a duty demanded by culture and command. Slowly, murmurs of disbelief spread through the camp. Was it possible that these foreigners, their sworn adversaries, treated faith as a matter of personal freedom rather than obligation? This sense of bewilderment only deepened when rumors began to circulate. A chaplain had reportedly visited the infirmary, offering words of comfort even to sick Japanese prisoners. Some said he prayed for their recovery. Others, skeptical, dismissed it as propaganda. But as more men witnessed these small acts of tolerance, American officers allowing prisoners to hold quiet moments of meditation or simply turning a blind eye when a Buddhist rosary appeared, the realization dawned. In this place, religion was not controlled by command. It existed freely, almost casually, as part of daily life. For many Japanese POWs, the first days in captivity became a study in contrasts. They had expected iron discipline, harsh retribution, and forced labor without dignity. Instead, they encountered routines tempered by unexpected allowances. To men raised in an atmosphere of conformity and duty, where every thought was regulated by the state, this strange freedom was unsettling. Some wondered if it was a trick meant to weaken their resolve. Others, however, began to see in it a glimpse of something radically different from anything they had known at home. It was the beginning of a slow and profound shock, the discovery that even behind barbed wire, the spirit could move without chains. For the Japanese prisoners, the confusion of captivity gradually gave way to reflection, and reflection inevitably led them back to the foundations of their identity. These men had been molded from childhood in an atmosphere where discipline and loyalty were elevated to near sacred levels. The Japanese Empire had long fused the concept of nation and faith into a singular doctrine, with the emperor not just a political leader, but a divine presence. To serve him was to serve the gods. To disobey him was to betray both state and heaven. School children bowed daily to the emperor's portrait, soldiers carried his words into battle, and rituals tied to Shinto shrines were performed with the seriousness of military drills. Religion was not optional, it was inseparable from obedience itself. This cultural upbringing created an inner world where duty was not questioned. For a soldier in the imperial army, personal faith meant less than collective devotion to the emperor and to the state ideology that proclaimed Japan's destiny. Shinto rites reinforced this bond, and Buddhism, though tolerated, often functioned as a quiet supplement rather than an independent path. The military machine ensured that every soldier marched to the same rhythm, not only in physical drills, but in thought and belief. To imagine religion as a personal choice was almost impossible. To imagine it existing outside of national obligation was unthinkable. Now, as POWs in American camps, these men confronted an alien reality. They began to recognize that their captors' discipline was of a different nature. American soldiers drilled and obeyed orders, but the foundation of their loyalty did not depend on worship of a leader as divine. The president was a man, not a god. The idea that religion could be separated from state authority was baffling for the Japanese. How could devotion and patriotism not be one and the same? How could faith be something private, exercised in small chapels, in groups, or alone, without any bearing on loyalty to one's nation? Prisoners whispered to each other about what they had seen. A guard with a Bible tucked under his arm, an officer removing his cap respectfully as he passed a chapel, soldiers granted permission to attend religious services according to their own preference. None of this fit into the framework of their cultural education. They tried to compare it to the emperor's divine status, but the comparison collapsed. Here was no enforced worship, no central shrine around which the entire state revolved, no mandatory rites that every man was compelled to perform. Instead, religion appeared as a choice, and one that did not weaken discipline but seemed to strengthen it. The more observant prisoners noticed another startling difference. In the Japanese military, deviation from the expected norm, even in private thought, was dangerous. Soldiers who expressed doubt about emperor worship or questioned the rituals risked suspicion, punishment, or worse. Within the camp, however, Americans allowed a spectrum of belief to exist side by side. Some attended services diligently, others ignored them entirely. Chaplains never shouted or coerced. They extended invitations rather than commands. To the Japanese mind, trained to obey without hesitation, this kind of voluntary devotion was an enigma. This realization unsettled many POWs. Some reacted with skepticism, convinced that the apparent freedom must hide a hidden strategy. Others, especially those already grappling with guilt or despair over surrender, began to feel cracks opening in their worldview. If Americans could practice faith without being forced, perhaps their strength lay in something other than sheer obedience. Perhaps the enemy's resilience came not only from weapons and factories, but also from an inner conviction that no general could dictate. Such thoughts were dangerous in their own way. To admit that freedom could coexist with discipline threatened the very foundation of what they had been taught since childhood. Yet captivity offered time, and time invited comparison. The strict devotion to the emperor that had once seemed unshakable began, for some, to appear less inevitable when measured against the strange new world inside barbed wire, where men saluted flags but prayed as they wished. The days of captivity settled into a rhythm. Work assignments, meals, inspections, all became routine. Yet among the endless repetition, one detail continued to draw the prisoners' attention: the small, unassuming buildings inside the camp that served no military purpose. At first, they seemed like storage sheds, plain wooden structures with little ornamentation. But soon the Japanese POWs realized what they truly were: chapels, houses of worship. And inside them, Americans gathered with an intensity and sincerity that unsettled the prisoners far more than any rifle or barbed wire. One afternoon, as the prisoners were marched across the compound, they saw a group of American soldiers standing outside one of these chapels. The men were laughing quietly, adjusting their uniforms, preparing to enter. A chaplain in khaki approached, carrying a worn Bible. The prisoners expected him to shout or give orders, but instead he greeted the soldiers warmly, like a friend. Then the soldiers filed in, removing their caps, their voices joining together in song. The sound carried across the camp, hymns sung in harmony, rising above the fences. It was not the voice of command. It was something freer, something unforced. For Japanese soldiers conditioned to view religion as obligation, the scene was deeply unsettling. Whispers spread quickly through the barracks. Some POWs were curious, others suspicious. Was this theater meant to impress them? Could it be a form of psychological warfare designed to suggest that Americans had a deeper unity than propaganda had claimed? Yet, as the weeks passed, they noticed that these chapels were not for show. They functioned daily, consistently, and without regard to whether Japanese prisoners were watching. Men prayed openly, confessed quietly to chaplains, and returned to their duties afterward with calm composure. It was not performance. It was life. A turning point came when chaplains began to appear among the prisoners themselves. They visited the infirmary, offering prayers for the sick and wounded, Japanese as well as American. Some POWs recoiled, unsure how to respond. Others listened silently, confused by the gentle words. One chaplain simply sat at the bedside of a feverish soldier, reading aloud in English. The meaning of the words was lost, but the tone, soothing, unthreatening, was unmistakable. The prisoners had never experienced such an approach. In their world, religious rituals were state-directed, impersonal, and inseparable from duty. Here, religion appeared as compassion, extended even to enemies. The most shocking revelation came when some POWs were invited, not compelled, to attend services. Guards gestured politely, making clear there was no obligation. A few brave men went, driven by curiosity. They returned shaken. Inside the chapel, no one demanded loyalty to a flag or emperor. Instead, men spoke of forgiveness, of inner peace, of a God who listened to each individual. The prisoners could hardly grasp the meaning, but the tone of voluntary devotion was undeniable. Unlike the rigid ceremonies at home, here one could bow his head or remain still. Participation was choice, not command. The sight of the cross itself stirred complex emotions. For some, it was a symbol of the enemy's alien culture, a reminder of their distance from home. For others, it became a mysterious emblem of endurance, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate through the camp. Prisoners whispered about it at night, wondering if this freedom to worship was the secret to the Americans' resolve. Gradually, the chapels became landmarks in the camp's mental geography. They stood as strange monuments of contradiction, sacred spaces within a prison, freedom within captivity. The Japanese POWs, accustomed to a life where faith was dictated by authority, found themselves staring at buildings where the very opposite occurred. Here, men could walk in or stay away, could kneel or remain upright, could pray or remain silent, and no punishment followed either choice. It was an inversion of everything they had known, and it planted questions in their hearts that captivity alone could not silence. For weeks, the Japanese prisoners circled the edges of this new reality, waiting for the catch, the hidden cruelty behind the apparent tolerance. But the longer they remained in the camps, the more undeniable it became. The Americans treated religion as a matter of personal freedom. In the beginning, some POWs tested the limits. A few knelt quietly in their barracks, murmuring fragments of Buddhist chants or silent Shinto prayers, half expecting a guard to burst in and bark orders to stop. But nothing happened. The guards glanced in, counted heads, and moved on. No reprimand, no punishment. For men who had been taught that spiritual life was inseparable from military loyalty, the absence of control was as shocking as it was liberating. One group of prisoners grew bolder. They gathered discreetly at dusk, using scraps of cloth to fashion small symbols of their faith. They sang in whispers, hesitant and uneven, their voices carrying only to the nearby bunks. When morning came, no consequences followed. Emboldened, they tried again the following evening. Still nothing. The realization began to spread. In this camp, even under the eye of the enemy, they could practice belief without fear. The guards neither encouraged nor obstructed them. To the Americans, faith was a private matter. For the Japanese prisoners, the sheer absence of interference felt almost unreal. The moment of clarity arrived in the camp square one Sunday morning. Chaplains organized a service and extended an open invitation, not only to American soldiers but to prisoners as well. Attendance was voluntary. A handful of POWs, driven by curiosity, stood at a distance as the service began. They noticed American soldiers arriving in small groups, some bowing their heads in prayer, others sitting quietly, a few not attending at all. No punishment befell those who stayed in their barracks. The choice was theirs alone. This was unthinkable in the Japanese military, where participation in rituals was mandatory and absence marked one as disloyal. Here, absence was simply permitted. The prisoners who ventured closer found themselves welcomed, not interrogated. Chaplains offered them hymn books, though few could read the English words. Some POWs listened as songs filled the chapel, astonished by the harmony of voices raised freely. No one scowled at them for not singing. No officer demanded they repeat the words. The service ended, and men left quietly, returning to their duties as if nothing unusual had happened. For the Japanese, this was nothing short of a revelation. The shock deepened when a Buddhist prisoner asked whether he might sit quietly during these services without participating. The answer, delivered through a translator, was simple: yes. There was no penalty, no suspicion, only acknowledgement of his freedom. Another prisoner, braver still, asked if he might continue his own traditional rites within the camp. The Americans agreed, provided it caused no disturbance. That night, in a corner of the barracks, incense smuggled through parcels from the Red Cross was lit. The air filled with the faint scent of home, and men bowed in reverence, hearts pounding at the thought of punishment that never came. For many, this freedom was more disorienting than captivity itself. They had prepared for chains and labor, not for the unsettling liberty to believe or disbelieve. It gnawed at their convictions. If the enemy allowed such choice, perhaps he was not the barbarian propaganda had described. And if faith could exist without compulsion, perhaps devotion to the emperor was not the only path a man could follow. These thoughts were dangerous, yet irresistible. Behind the fences, surrounded by guards, the Japanese POWs discovered a paradox. Their bodies were confined, but their souls, for the first time, seemed untethered. By the time the first months of captivity had passed, what had seemed like an oddity became part of daily life. The Japanese POWs realized that their captors were not simply permitting religion as a curiosity for Americans alone. They were granting the same space to prisoners themselves. Shinto rituals, Buddhist chants, even personal meditation, all were tolerated. Some guards even provided small courtesies, scraps of wood for makeshift altars, paper for prayers, or quiet allowance for incense when parcels from home or the Red Cross contained it. Nothing was forced, nothing forbidden, so long as it remained peaceful. For soldiers raised in an environment where Shinto rites were inseparable from state ideology, the very act of performing a ritual without imperial command felt strange. Back home, shrines were extensions of the emperor's authority, places where soldiers were reminded of their sacred duty to die for him. In camp, however, these rites became personal, almost private. A bow before an improvised altar was no longer a national act, but an individual one, carried out for comfort, not for obligation. This subtle shift disturbed some and consoled others. For the first time, religion was disentangled from discipline. Buddhism, too, found its place behind the wire. Some prisoners recalled chants taught by their families, rhythms of sutras once murmured in childhood. They gathered in small groups, repeating these words with soft intensity. No officer demanded they stop. No guard threatened them with punishment. Instead, Americans walked by without comment, as if such gatherings were ordinary. The effect was powerful. Men who had thought themselves stripped of dignity discovered that they could reclaim it in these moments of prayer. Even those who had abandoned faith during years of war now found themselves drawn to familiar rituals, rediscovering pieces of an identity nearly lost to the machinery of empire. What startled the prisoners even more was the openness of Christianity within the camp. Chaplains not only welcomed Americans, but extended their services to prisoners, offering Bibles in Japanese translation when available, or simply speaking through interpreters. At first, suspicion reigned. Many POWs assumed this was a strategy to convert them, to undermine their loyalty. But what they saw contradicted this fear. The chaplains offered, never forced. Some men attended services out of curiosity and then never returned. Others came back, intrigued by the strange message of forgiveness and individual worth. For a soldier trained to see himself only as part of a collective, the idea that he mattered as a single soul was disorienting. Yet some clung to it, finding comfort in its gentleness. Tales circulated of men who quietly adopted fragments of Christianity. One prisoner was seen fashioning a small cross from twigs, keeping it hidden in his uniform pocket. Another was heard repeating the words of a hymn phonetically, without understanding the meaning, simply because its melody had calmed him. Such stories sparked debate within the barracks. Was this betrayal? Or was it survival, a way to endure captivity by borrowing strength from the enemy's faith? For some, the distinction mattered little. Religion, whether Shinto, Buddhist, or Christian, had become a lifeline. The Americans seemed indifferent to which path the prisoners chose. Chaplains might smile if a man attended their service, but they showed no anger when he declined. Guards nodded in acknowledgment when incense was burned, but they did not intervene. To the Japanese, this neutrality was the greatest shock of all. They had never seen a society where the state's power stopped at the threshold of belief. Here, inside a prison, religion was not a tool of command. It was left to each man to decide, and that decision was respected. For soldiers trained to obey in everything, this freedom was bewildering and quietly transformative. As captivity stretched into seasons, the Japanese prisoners found themselves thinking less about survival and more about meaning. Daily routines dulled the fear of immediate death, but in its place came a strange emptiness. Men who had once believed their lives destined for glorious sacrifice in battle now found themselves alive, idle, and haunted by shame. In that silence, religion became more than ritual. It became a mirror. For the first time, some POWs were free to ask questions they had never dared to whisper under the shadow of the emperor's gaze. In the barracks, small circles of men began to form. Some recited Buddhist sutras, the familiar cadence soothing their restless minds. Others bowed silently before makeshift Shinto symbols, remembering family shrines left far away. And yet, many who had never cared deeply for faith now felt drawn to it. Captivity had stripped them of identity, but ritual gave them fragments of self. A prisoner who once mocked religion found himself kneeling beside comrades, not because he had suddenly believed, but because the act itself calmed the storm inside him. Diaries, smuggled in through Red Cross parcels or written on scraps of packaging, became sacred objects. In these fragile pages, men poured their thoughts about prayer, guilt, and survival. Some compared their freedom in captivity to their confinement back home. One man wrote that in Japan he could not choose his faith, but in America he could even refuse it without punishment. Another confessed that he had never understood why Americans fought so fiercely until he saw them pray voluntarily, believing their God walked beside them. These private writings, hidden in boots and mattresses, later revealed the deep cracks forming in the worldview of men who had once considered faith nothing but a tool of the state. There were stories of unexpected comfort. In the infirmary, a chaplain sat with a dying prisoner, reciting prayers. The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable, gentle, human. The prisoner, too weak to respond, later whispered to his comrades that for the first time since capture, he had felt seen as an individual, not as part of a defeated enemy. In another barrack, a man who had lost his brother in the war found solace in chanting aloud every evening, while others sat nearby in respectful silence. They were not commanded to join, but many did, drawn by the rhythm, finding in it something they could not name. The contrast with wartime Japan grew sharper with each passing week. Back home, religion had been a mechanism of control infused into military drills, parades, and national holidays. In camp, it was voluntary, even fragile. It did not demand obedience, it invited reflection. This freedom allowed some men to rediscover childhood faith long buried, while others experimented with beliefs they had never known. Christianity, strange and foreign, attracted a few with its promise of forgiveness. Shinto and Buddhism, stripped of state authority, became more personal, more intimate. The emotional impact was profound. Men who had once bowed only because duty demanded it now bowed because they wanted to. Others who had feared divine punishment discovered peace in the quiet acceptance of choice. For many, the realization that the enemy respected their inner lives was more shocking than defeat itself. It was not merely tolerance, it was acknowledgement of their humanity. And in the long nights behind barbed wire, that acknowledgement was enough to keep despair from consuming them. Captivity had stolen their weapons, their uniforms, and their pride. But strangely, it had given them something else in return: the freedom to believe or not to believe in ways they had never imagined possible. For Japanese POWs who had marched to war certain of their destiny, this freedom was both unsettling and liberating, a revelation that reshaped how they saw themselves and their captors. Gradually, the role of religion in the camps evolved from a private solace into a bridge across the seemingly unbridgeable gulf between captor and captive. In the early months, Japanese prisoners had regarded chaplains with suspicion, viewing them as extensions of propaganda. But over time, their steady kindness eroded distrust. Chaplains did not preach with force. They listened, shared small comforts, and sometimes simply sat quietly with prisoners who spoke no English at all. This absence of compulsion, combined with the presence of genuine compassion, began to dismantle the iron wall of resentment. The guards, too, played a role in this slow transformation. Many of them were ordinary young Americans, some barely older than the prisoners themselves. When they paused to allow POWs time for meditation or carried messages to chaplains about sick men requesting prayers, the boundaries between enemy and human blurred. It was not unusual for guards to stand respectfully nearby as prisoners carried out Buddhist chants or bowed toward an improvised Shinto altar. For Japanese soldiers trained to expect humiliation, this quiet respect was more disarming than any weapon. Dialogue began in fragments, stitched together through translators or halting English. Prisoners asked why Americans worshipped so freely, why no punishment awaited those who skipped services, why some soldiers read their Bibles while others did not. The answers were simple, sometimes clumsy, but always the same. Faith was a choice. The concept struck like lightning. For men raised to believe loyalty and worship were indistinguishable, to witness a society where belief could be chosen and yet discipline remained intact was transformative. As these conversations spread, faith became a common ground. Some prisoners admitted that they prayed for families back home, hoping their loved ones had survived the bombings. Chaplains listened without judgment, often offering prayers of their own, even if for another god. At first, the Japanese thought this a mockery, but gradually they saw it as empathy. The notion that an enemy could pray for their families, not to manipulate but to comfort, shook their assumptions to the core. Stories circulated of surprising connections. One chaplain reportedly learned a few Japanese phrases and recited them awkwardly during a visit to the infirmary, earning smiles from the sick men. Another brought hymnals with Japanese translations, a gesture that stunned the prisoners who had assumed their captors cared nothing for their culture. When Christmas arrived, chapels were decorated with modest wreaths, and POWs were invited to join. Some attended, marveling at the blend of solemn ritual and joyous song. The warmth of candles, the sound of carols, the absence of compulsion. It all felt like a strange dream. For the first time, some prisoners confessed they felt less like enemies and more like fellow humans caught in the same storm of war. Faith softened hostilities in ways that food or shelter alone could not. It opened cracks in the hardened armor of propaganda, allowing moments of mutual recognition. Prisoners began to see their captors not merely as victors, but as men who also longed for peace, who also wept for the dead, who also turned to something greater in moments of despair. And for the guards, the prisoners ceased to be faceless enemies. They became men of faith, men with families, men who prayed in different words but for the same universal hopes. Behind barbed wire, faith became more than ritual. It became a language neither side had to translate fully, a bridge stronger than propaganda, softer than steel, but enduring. For the Japanese POWs, the discovery that religion could unite rather than divide was as shocking as the freedom to practice it in the first place. It was a lesson they would carry long after the war ended. When the war finally ended and the gates of captivity swung open, the Japanese prisoners walked into a world they no longer recognized. The empire that had once demanded their absolute loyalty had collapsed. Cities lay in ruins, and the emperor himself had renounced his divinity. Yet even as they returned home to this shattered reality, the memories of camp life remained vivid. For many, what stayed with them most was not the barbed wire or the shame of surrender, but the strange, liberating discovery that even in captivity they had been free in ways they had never known in their homeland. On ships carrying them back across the Pacific, prisoners whispered about what they had seen. Some spoke of chapels filled with song, where men prayed not because they were forced, but because they desired to. Others recalled the first time they dared light incense without fear of reprisal, or the moment they realized they could refuse participation altogether. The shock of such freedom had left marks deeper than any physical scar. To men taught that their worth was measured by obedience to the emperor, it was staggering to discover a society where faith was voluntary, where the state's power did not extend into the soul. Upon returning to Japan, these former prisoners faced mixed receptions. Families embraced them with relief, but society often regarded them with suspicion. Surrender was still considered shameful, and captivity tainted their honor. Yet many of these men carried within them a quiet resilience born of their experiences in American camps. They had seen another way of living, another model of belief. Some whispered to relatives about the chaplains who had prayed for Japanese families, about the hymns that carried peace into long nights, about the simple fact that Americans allowed them to bow, chant, or remain silent without punishment. These stories spread quietly, planting seeds of change in post-war Japan. For a few, the impact was even more direct. Some former POWs embraced Christianity after their return, unable to forget the message of forgiveness they had encountered. Others deepened their commitment to Buddhism or Shinto, now practiced not as instruments of nationalism, but as personal paths. The central lesson was not which religion they followed, but that they had discovered the possibility of choice. They had experienced faith stripped of compulsion, and it had altered them. Historians later recorded testimonies of prisoners who admitted that their time in captivity challenged everything they had believed about the enemy. They had expected cruelty and humiliation, but instead encountered tolerance and respect for the human spirit. "In the camp," one man wrote, "I was no longer just a soldier of Japan. I was a man allowed to think of the gods on my own terms." Another recalled the bewilderment of watching Americans argue passionately about politics, yet pray side by side in church. Such contradictions revealed a society far more complex and far freer than Japanese propaganda had described. The irony was impossible to ignore. Behind barbed wire, under armed guard, the prisoners had found a freedom of spirit that many had never known as free men in Japan. This paradox haunted them long after their release. For some, it became a source of quiet strength during the difficult years of rebuilding. For others, it remained an unresolved question. Why had they discovered the dignity of spiritual freedom only in defeat, only in captivity, only at the hands of the enemy? And yet, whether embraced or resisted, the memory endured. The image of chapels standing inside the camps, of guards permitting incense smoke to rise into the night, of prayers whispered without punishment. These became indelible symbols. They were reminders that even in the darkest chapters of war, there were moments when humanity surfaced, when freedom reached across fences, and when the soul of a man could rise higher than his circumstances. For the Japanese POWs, the greatest shock of captivity was not the loss of liberty, but the unexpected gift of discovering it in a place they had least expected.